given my old narrative, for anyone that might be listening and have it that, great sleep isn't available to them, it's just how it is for them or whatever, wherever they might be, that I am confident that one, if I can do it, they can do it. Two, what I've gotten the opportunity to see over the years is, since every person we work with has to wear an Aura ring to participate in the majority of our programs, I've seen a lot of data on what's possible. And there is so much more available than I think the average person might realize, of things that you can do to influence your sleep results and your nervous system results, and many metrics that show up, not only just in your wearable data, just for the game of it, but also the subjective experience of the confidence that you can have with your sleep.
In this next episode, I get to interview Mollie Eastman, sleep expert. If you are someone who is looking how to maximize your sleep, perhaps having trouble sleeping, wanting to know how to stack your hacks to get the best sleep, wondering how to increase your sleep and optimize your sleep in real life scenarios like a late night out with friends or kids waking you up through the night, this episode is for you. Mollie Eastman is the owner of the Sleep is a Skill podcast. She has been on hundreds of interviews and interviewed some of the top sleep experts. She is such a wealth of information. In this podcast, we are going to share real-world tips and tools that you can apply amidst your real-world life where you can't control every scenario. This can impact your health, your mood, your waistline, and so much more. Enjoy. Mollie, I'm so excited for this interview. You are like every girl's girl. I got to sit with you at dinner a few events ago, and I just loved picking your brain. I think every woman that listens to this is going to feel like they're in your living room with you. You're so real, such a wealth of information. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Oh my goodness, that is one of my favorite interviews, or introductions, I should say, that I've had in a while. So thank you for saying that, because the feeling is so mutual. I was sharing with you before hitting record that, there's a lot of things on your calendar, but this one came up, and I genuinely could not wait for this conversation, because I love the work you're doing. I love how you show up in the world. Amazing. So I am appreciative of the opportunity.
Thank you. Awesome. All right. Well, this is going to be really fun. We're going to just literally dive right into it. This is basically, in my mind, we're speaking to two different women here and all the women in between. So basically, as a sleep expert, I want to help the woman who has been perhaps biohacking, wears the trackers, whether it's like an Aura ring or all the things, has some basic, if not intermediate knowledge of circadian rhythm and how to benefit their sleep, but then what to do when real life happens. So I want to speak to that woman, right? We go out at night, maybe we have some drinks, maybe we have kids who keep us up, all the things.
Totally.
And then I also want to speak to the woman who's maybe curious, but very new to this conversation about, how being on our screens, if you're putting in work late at night or you're watching a movie with your kids, your lights are blaring at night or in the morning, how that can impact our health, our mood, our waistline. I think that's what's going to get women here, that pain point. So all the things. So I'm really, really excited. Before we dive in, I want to just get a background of, why did you get into this?
Yeah.
Sleep? I know you're so passionate about it and it's so important. It completely impacts our life. But what happened in your life that created this curiosity for you?
Such a good question. And I hope that it speaks to the listener, because I can tell you that I continue to be shocked that this is my career, and grateful, because it was not the original intention. And so what life looked like for me, I really now think of it as a 3-part series. And so on the front end, and it all having to do with sleep. But I'll explain. So the first part of my life, I really didn't think too much about my sleep, honestly. And I ran my life having a lot of labels and narratives around my sleep. And I would say things like, I'm a short sleeper, I'm a night owl, it's in my genes, I'll sleep when I'm dead. What's the big deal? Just kind of survive whatever lot in life, whatever cards I was dealt around this sleep conversation. Not much to look at here was the thinking. So I had it that it was this kind of fixed thing, and not much that you would do to really influence it. And I kept running things that way, not connecting the dots when I started having more kind of deleterious effects happening and showing up in my health, looking like I had the beginnings of an ulcer. I had shingles in my 20s. I had
Oh,
painful periods, mounting anxiety, just a number of things that were showing that something wasn't quite working in how I was managing many aspects of my health, but not factoring really sleep much into the equation until I went through this period of insomnia as a serial entrepreneur in Manhattan, burning the candle at both ends, and getting more and more pronounced with my behaviors and justified and righteous the whole time. And I would say things like, well, I'm an entrepreneur, I make my own hours, so I'll just sleep in later. What's the big deal? And so everything got more and more extreme. And then eventually, my husband and I, we've been together 13 years and kind of in the more beginning of our relationship, both entrepreneurs, we decided to be a la Tim Ferriss type ethos and get a one-way ticket and become digital nomads. And so we put everything in storage, but we also took with us, lots of stress with our businesses and responsibilities and employees and all the things. And so when we landed in Madrid as our first place with lots of jet lag, I grew up with, not a lot of money, hadn't really traveled anywhere significant, never really experienced jet lag, nor all of this stress. Pair those all together. And the first night I had a panic attack when we landed. And I was like, oh my God, did we make a mistake? Like, this is too much instability
mhm.
and, unknowns with this like one way ticket and unclear of like what we were going to be doing. And so that first night, then I'm already had been up in a long stretch of time because of the travel and what have you. Then the panic attack, then I'm up even longer. Then in retrospect, I did everything not to do. Now I know these things, but at the time I didn't know. And so then I'm just trying to steal sleep from every possible, place I can steal it. So if I can get some sleep during the day or night or whatever, and not the best way to approach it. So it just keeps getting worse and worse. And eventually I start almost developing this sleep anxiety. So then when the sun would be setting, my heart would start racing of, oh my God, another night of just laying there. But also, it began to ripple into feeling like I'm losing my mind, like scary. Like, am I stuck like this? Did something happen? Did I flip some sort of switch and now I can never go back to normal sleeper?
Oh,
All of those thoughts that can come up.
mhm.
So eventually
Future
I went to
tripping.
yeah, future tripping, tons of future tripping, just of emphasis on kind of what's ahead. Is this always going to be like this? And then a sense of a lack of understanding of what to do. So eventually I went to the doctors. And at this point, we were in Croatia. So I go in with, kind of as much translating from my phone as I possibly can and leave with sleeping pills. And in that moment, realizing and this was a mix of benzodiazepines, kind of old school approach, which really we're not recommending as first line treatment for sleep issues. And yet that's what I was given. So there came to be this kind of moment of, all right, it looks like if I'm going to figure this out or if I'm going to get to the source of it, I'm going to need to figure this out myself, was how it felt to me at the time. And I had a lot of questions of why is there not like sleep AA or kind of support groups that we could go to so that you don't feel so alone and you can realize that you're not the only person dealing with this, but it can feel like that when it's 3 in the morning and you're just staring at the ceiling, you haven't slept and whatever. So then I embark on this whole quest to figure out what does it even take to get great sleep, not just because of philosophical reasons, but because I really wanted to figure this out. And I was fearful. I was very fearful because I came from a history of a family with a lot of mental health issues. And I was afraid that then this is kind of the trigger point for something bigger and fears that now I'm going to be on pharmaceuticals for the rest of my life. And, what does this spell? What does this mean for me? So go down this rabbit hole and discover a lot of things, spend a lot of time, energy, effort, money, and found things that didn't work, but also found things that did work. And eventually, on the flip side of it, what got created was sleep as a skill. And so this company kind of started organically because once I started restoring my sleep after a lot of things, then I could not stop talking about it. And I had been on a million forums or what have you. And so I started just sharing with some of the other people that were really struggling, some of the things that I was starting to implement, that what I was discovering, what worked, what didn't work, and then starting to have just organic kind of conversations and small groups and just kind of grew. So On the other side of this, today, now what life looks like is we have online courses to help support people with their sleep. We have weekly newsletters that we've been setting up for over 5 years. We have a particular niche in high stakes poker. So I work with a lot of high stakes poker players, which is an interesting kind of analogy or parallel because they're in casinos designed on purpose to confuse the circadian rhythm,
Oh,
which is a big aspect of the work that we do is circadian rhythm entrainment. So they're a nice example. And then we also are now in luxury hotels, work with different partnerships and corporations, and with the number two sleep podcast. Now we have lots of different experts come on. I say all that just not just to say it, but I say it because given my old narrative for anyone that might be listening and have it that, great sleep isn't available to them, it's just how it is for them or whatever, wherever they might be, that I am confident that one, if I can do it, they can do it. Two, what I've gotten the opportunity to see over the years is since every person we work with has to wear an aura ring to participate in the majority of our programs, I've seen a lot of data on what's possible. And there is so much more available than I think the average person might realize of things that you can do to influence your sleep results and your nervous system results and many metrics that show up not only just in your wearable data, just for the game of it, but also the subjective experience of the confidence that you can have with your sleep.
love it. Love it all. There's so much there. And I'm so excited to dive into those things, like all the things that can be done to impact sleep. One of the things I've heard you say at a certain point is, well, first of all, I think your story is very familiar, whether it's like the entire story or pieces of that story. I think so many people have suffered with sleep issues and challenges.
Yes.
And I was blown away when I heard you on a podcast say something like, we sleep an average of 26 years of our life,
Yes.
a third of our
On
lives.
average. Yes. 26 years. It makes sense to think about it.
Yeah. And that medical doctors have how much training in sleep?
2 hours of training on average. That's even out of Harvard Med, some of our most respected med school programs, Ivy League, still seeing on average around 2 hours. So if we expect that some of our things or red flags or problems with our sleep are going to be caught or aided by our primary care doctor, fairly unlikely, just given that stat and not necessarily a front to or anything about what they're doing or their interest levels. I'm sure they would love to know, and they're unfortunately in a industry or environment where they themselves are set up against getting great sleep, especially when we look at kind of the system or management for medical institutions and maybe the lack of appreciation or understanding for sleep and supporting of sleep for them themselves. So it makes sense for us to get curious about this so that we can advocate for ourselves.
Yeah, and just the lighting that they're surrounded by, right? In hospitals and medical offices, which I know we're going to talk about. I know lighting is huge. So
Yeah.
let's dive in. I do want to talk about some foundational pieces for some of those out there who this may be a completely new conversation. And I think even for people who've heard some of these concepts, you've got some great tidbits of take home information. So let's talk circadian rhythm. Let's talk about why it's essential for our sleep, our mood, our health, and then waistline. I think that's just a very curious topic, circadian rhythm and waistline. So, what's the connection between all those things?
Ah, so good. Because mostly, and I know I've already just sort of thrown out this term circadian rhythm with one out without properly really defining it. It's this 24-hour rhythm kind of that we used to be more aligned to when we lived outdoors and it just naturally sort of synced. So the rising, the setting of the sun, this 24-hour rhythm of the Earth's rotation. We were just unequivocally, we were tethered to it. We couldn't really escape it very in a meaningful way. But now we have the opportunity to kind of create our own hours, and therein lies both the optionality, yay, but then also the problems that could come about from that. So, circadian rhythm, many times when people hear about that, it might just harken thoughts of our sleep and our wake, which is totally true. It's the one of the very clear aspects of circadian health is our sleep wake cycle. But turns out, and this is why I'm so passionate about even for in the wellness space that I believe circadian rhythms will be one of the next big things in wellness because it also ripples into virtually every other aspect of health. So, your mental health, your immune function, your cardiovascular health, reproductive health, your waistline, as you so perfectly pointed to, glucose regulation, hormonal regulation of many aspects, not just sleep related cortisol and melatonin, but also our sex hormones. When we think of things like leptin and ghrelin, when we think of glucose and insulin, I mean, it's just so far reaching and spiders into really the experience of what it is to be alive gets impacted when this is not working. And for anyone who has traveled long haul travel, where you go, whatever, from New York to Hong Kong or something, like an egregious jump in time zones, you'll feel the bizarre experience that that brings about, and just you just feel off and just wrong or something, right?
Yes,
In
fuzzy.
many aspects, including like questions arise where you didn't even think there might be going. Why am I going to the bathroom at 3 in the morning? And what is happening? So there's so many things that get impacted. Now, the bright side of all this, no pun intended, is that you have the opportunity to utilize the blueprint of kind of an optimal circadian health. So aligning with these rhythms of nature, not just because it's like nice to be synced up with sunrise and sunset, but because we are really biologically hardwired as diurnal creatures, meaning we're meant to be active by day and at rest at night. And when we start deviating from that, we know that there appears to be these real world consequences where the World Health Organization ranks shift working, for instance, as a possible cancer causing agent. And so when we think about that, it's like, well, why might that be? Well, we just see a big uptick in a number of kind of deleterious health impacts just simply by being active and awake at the times when we traditionally would have been asleep. And so it starts to beg the question of this and have us look into this world of chronobiology, the science of time and how time affects our biology. And what is really nice is that all the things that are really trending in the world of wellness, when we talk about cold plunging and saunas and, you know, continuous glucose monitors and all these things, they start to have very clear timelines by which they might be optimally utilized.
What do you mean? Tell me more about that.
I totally. Thank you. Yeah. So to expand on that, what the heck does that mean? Well,
Yeah.
for instance, so when we think about the various things that can impact our circadian rhythm, one, light dark is huge, and you mentioned that. We'll definitely spend some time on that. So that's one of our most powerful zeitgeibers. But then, even in alignment with that, nestled kind of underneath that is temperature timing, for instance, thermal regulation. And one of those things that can start to go awry, especially for women at different points, right? Throughout the perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause. So the thermal regulation aspect can start to not be as count onable as it maybe used to be, or we might have to navigate it newly. So how do we set up as many aspects of our environment and behaviors to pull for optimal thermal regulation? So some things that we can do involve how can we support the natural kind of uptick in body temperature by day and then market drop by night. It's one of the things we see as we age, that we tend to see more of a flattening of that curve for many individuals. So we want to see how can we help bolster this a bit. So, for instance, cold plunging, it's sort of counterintuitive because when you cold plunge, after that exposure to cold, we have a paradoxical warming effect thereafter, and also an excitatory effect. So, that dopamine release, norepinephrine, kind of a hormetic stressor, but then also that body temperature warms up. It's almost as if the body kind of over course corrects or something to
Yeah.
get us back because it cares so deeply about homeostasis and bringing us back to kind of our baseline, if you will. So then it warms us up more than we might have been without that intervention. The same rules seem to apply for sauna use, where despite it warming us up quite markedly, it appears to then drop our body temperature cooler than it would have been without that intervention. So, the general wisdom from a circadian perspective can be, if you're going to utilize these practices, which can be amazing for sleep and for circadian health, then Can we put our cold exposure largely by day? Because then after that, you're having that warming effect. And that's what we're trying to cultivate is that warm body temperature by day. And then in the evening, bringing about our heat therapy, because then that can actually result in more of that cooling effect that we're trying to protect. So that would be one example of these things. Now that also goes into things like, the kind of trendy nature, or not even trendy, but the practical applications of our meal timings, our awareness around glucose and other things, that those exist on their own circadian rhythm. So we know that by virtue of wearing different wearables, and CGMs, that the same type of meal that you might have at 8 a.m. is going to likely yield a very different results at 8 p.m. and often have a higher spike propensity or possibility in the evening, just by virtue of having it later in the evening, because of our natural inclination to shift some of our leptin and ghrelin kind of balance, as well as glucose and insulin. And it appears that we're able to handle some of these things a bit more when the light of day is present. So it almost gives you a timeline. So one of the things we do with people is we give them what we call our circadian crafted day kind of sheet. And then on there, we have them design their days from a circadian lens. So they are choosing when they wake up around 7 days a week is really our goal. Our aim is to have our weekdays look pretty identical to our weekends. So they have that consistent wake up. Then paired as closely as possible with that consistent wake up is bright light exposure, and they're physically getting outside, no sunglasses, hats, ideally not from behind a window. So you're physically outside to get that bright light in your eyes. And you're doing that anchored on the first part of your day. And then we spill into, where does your meal timing go? When does it stop? Where do your exercise timing go? Where does the cold plunge? Where does the sauna go? All of those sort of things, so that we can help facilitate that all of these hormones are kind of functioning at the times that we're looking to support them.
Okay, love that. So, two great takeaways. I love that. I've never heard this explained this way.
Oh,
Sauna
good.
during the day.
Oh, so good.
No,
So
wait,
sauna, yes,
I'm gonna
exactly.
mix
So
them up.
because this is so counterintuitive, because it doesn't even
Right.
seem to like logically make sense. So it's like, okay,
It's the
so
other
you're
one.
saying, right, you're saying that the body temperature piece should be rising throughout the course of the day and then dropping markedly at night to help bring about sleep onset. So then why the heck would we bring in cold by day, heat by night? But it is that odd paradoxical effect thereafter. So for instance, we had if anyone's familiar with Eight Sleep, the cooling mattress toppers, we had one of the kind of researchers from Eight Sleep on the podcast and was pointing to uh, dozens of studies that showed a particular emerging, somewhat of a protocol, if you will, of around 1 to 2 hours before bed, having heat exposure for at least about 10 minutes and seeming to help facilitate sleep onset and quality thereafter. So it's like one of those practical things. And then the cooling piece happening more by day.
Okay, perfect. So there's the temperature one. I
Yes.
want to touch on the food one. And then
Yeah,
I want to talk about light because I know we both love light. Okay,
totally.
so the food one. So I know protein is really important, protein and fat. I think we have similar lifestyles and how we
Totally.
eat, right? I have heard that you want your last meal of the day to be less protein heavy. Is that true when we're talking about circadian rhythm and getting good sleep?
Yes, such a tricky one. Now, here's what I'll say about that one. So far what we're seeing from a sleep perspective, and then there's all kinds of other theories from, general wellness, nutrition, what have you. But if we're talking about studies that support the types of food by evening for sleep, then it gets a little bit more murky. So what I would say is, one, that's where at bare minimum we're looking to facilitate a glucose stabilizing nutrition and diet plan, whatever that might look like for you. And we do have, it's interesting from a sleep perspective, some of the most robust studies pointing to the Mediterranean diet, just as an example. Now, does that mean that that's the only diet that will facilitate sleep? Absolutely not. It just so happens that that's where we have the bulk of these studies. But it does point to some of the potential benefits of making sure that you're getting kind of that well-rounded diet, at least for what they found to influence some of the quality of that sleep, particularly some of those healthy fats. It does start to bring into question how many carbs, how much protein, and that gets a little more murky. Here's what I would caution people on though, is that many people might talk about, oh, you want to get more of your carbs in the evening to facilitate sleep, which some people do find that to be beneficial. But I would say that's where I love the glucose monitors, because when people start to introduce more carbs, especially if they have been more low carb leaning, then one of the things I often see is that they are, unbeknownst to them, spiking. And later, because as we kind of noted, that sometimes we're less able to deal and handle the addition of carbs later on. So we want to make sure that we're striking that happy, balance of macros, so that you've got your some element of protein, some element of fat, so that when you are playing with your carb amount, that you're not just spiking and then going to have this whole stretch of time before bed. Because then we find for compliance that once you reliably crash after that spike, then you tend to be craving for things at the wrong times. And that's when we see people kind of start in these behavior patterns that aren't circadian aligned. So one circadian aligned piece is called circadian rhythm intermittent fasting, and it's aiming to largely eat most of your food when the sun is out and less of your food when the sun has set. Bare minimum is 2 to 3 hours before bed. We have a lot of research around that. But I also say anecdotally that we see for wearable data longer stretches appearing to be beneficial. So, for instance, I just had the opportunity to speak with the vice president of performance sciences at Whoop, and they're undergoing a study which looks really favorable between people that have their last bite of food 2 hours before bed versus 4 hours before bed. And it appears that the 4 hour group has much more favorable results than the 2 hour group. And that's in alignment with what I see from the amount of wearable data that I'm in, is that when you stretch it longer, and I also see things like 5 hours, 6 hours before bed being really beneficial for people. Now, some people has probably seen, like, if you're in that biohacker camp, like you're mentioning, might have seen people and reports on people like Brian Johnson, and kind of quantifying so many aspects of health. One of the things that he's pointing to is, for him, 10 hours before bed before having that last bite of
Oh.
food. So there's a range. Now, for
Mhm.
me, one of the things that I've landed on is kind of a afternoon meal timing pretty consistently, but it will ebb and flow based on where I'm at in my cycle. So, say if I'm on the front end of my cycle, I might be ending at like 2 p.m. or so of my last bite of food. So kind of like a dinner, like a lunch dinner, instead of brunch is breakfast, lunch, brunch. So dinner, lunch, dinner. So I'll do that around like 2 p.m. or so. And then when I'm luteal in the second half of my cycle, which I am right now, then I might push it a little bit further, more like whatever, 4 p.m., 5 p.m., something like an early bird special. And then it's a little bit more gentle of a digestive break.
Yeah, so it almost sounds like for people who are into intermittent fasting, they could even flip that window and put it
Exactly.
at night, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you're just front loading. So, what it would look like is, because I used to do the traditional intermittent fasting where you skip breakfast and you push things out. But our concern is from a compliance aspect, when you say if you're having your first bite of food, and this is from a circadian piece, you're looking, when do I have my first bite of food? When do I have my last bite of food? Because that's when it's really turning on these kind of clocks, these peripheral clocks in your body. So, if you're not having your first bite of food till much later, what tends to happen is then you're backloading your caloric intake till later into the evening. And that's where we can get into some trouble, because one of the reliable things we see when that happens and when you're eating later is then heart rate going up, HRV tending to go down, body temperature tending to go up, respiratory rate tending to go up, and for some can have some spillover into blood oxygen. But particularly if you have sleep disorders like sleep apnea, upper airway resistance syndrome, things like that, that can flare up more of that. We're very clear on that. Like later meal timing seems to flare up some of that snoring or apneas.
Great. Super, super helpful. Love that. Thank you. Okay, let's pivot to light because I really
Yeah.
want to get into this topic. I think this is so powerful. And I think this is something, I mean, everything you've talked about, we can really control. I think this is one of the things that I have at least found in my own life has made such an impact is controlling light. So I know you touched on shift workers, right? So I
Yeah.
think a lot of people think about maybe someone who has a messed up circadian rhythm would be a shift worker or like your Vegas poker players.
Yeah,
And that makes
totally.
sense in our mind. But what I want people to understand is so many of us are living a lifestyle that is also impacting our circadian rhythm almost just as much as theirs. So you think about the Vegas poker player and the lights are on all hours of the night so that you have no idea what time it is. Well, someone explained it to me this way in chiropractic school and I loved it. It made so much sense. And I heard you bring this up as well. Like our DNA, our genes have not changed since we were cave people. Back then, if the sun had not come up yet or the sun had gone down, the only color light we saw was from a fire.
Yeah.
So you think red, orange, that's all we're meant to see. So if you look outside, if you're in an office building, if you're in your home, especially those people who live in, the Northeast in winter and it's dark outside, your body wants it to be dark inside. So you think about how many times we are not aligning with that piece of our body's innate intelligence. Right. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the impact that that has on our health, maybe our mood, our sleep, and then all the things that we can do to help mitigate it. I think this is some of the most powerful information, or at least what I'm super passionate about.
Same. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really believe that sleep is a story of light and that it's so crucial for us to understand that in order to begin to get our sleep right, we got to get our light right. And most people, you might hear this and then just think, well, that's so basic. I mean, what do I just turn off the lights at night or, have a dark room? I've heard this. Turns out that the practical application of what we're talking about might be a bit more layered. So, one, so that the listener can find themselves in this conversation, it might be important to note that in 2023, I mentioned, I believe, the scientific consensus. Now, it pointed to the fact that the average person is by day getting, or they're in and swimming in an environment that is around 100 times too dim as compared to our ancestors, and the evening is around 100 times too bright as compared to even the brightest moonlit evenings, which, by the way, there's thinkings that lunar and lunatic might have had origins kind of together, of acting out of accordance when it would be the timing of the moon and what have you, because that light from the moon really was one of our only other light sources outside of, to your point, with fire, which fire is so crucial. It's like one of our first ever biohacks, basically, to extend the days before. There was presumably a whole period when humans just had they were totally tethered to the rhythms of nature. And then we had our first sort of the flint and the whole thing. And then we make a fire. And then we're able to expand our days a little bit, but it's expensive sort of resources. You got to get the wood, you got to do all these things. It progressed to candles and lanterns, but often that had a price attached to it, to the oils and to burn these candles. So it was actually kind of a hierarchy of classes that could even have extra light and stay up later. So there's all this sort of history right behind the management of how we would have lived our lifestyles. But now there's kind of, I guess you could say, on the bright side, no pun intended, that there's been a democratization of the aspect of being able to expand our days 24/7, have a Vegas lifestyle. So you could look at that as being an advancement, but it turns out from a biological perspective, we have totally unforeseen impacts on our biology. So out of that same scientific consensus, it was referencing 200 and almost 50 circadian scientists pulling from almost 2,700 peer reviewed publications, all calling for warning labels on the light bulbs when used at night. And why would that be? Well, because they found that not only was that impacting our sleep wake cycles, but also things that might be unexpected, like you pointed to. So, the waistline piece. So, obesity, diabetes, cancers, psychiatric disorders, reproductive disorders. So, all these far reaching impacts just simply by, like, what? Using a light bulb, a 60-watt light bulb in your living room at night could be having all these impacts. That's what we're starting to understand, especially since around the 80s into 90s, much more of a push around using energy efficient bulbs, LEDs, and LEDs having a much wider band of these cool tones. So, particularly a lot of blue light, a little bit of green, but certainly not this beautiful rainbow that we would experience from the sun. And also, that's very different from Edison's light bulb, which was invented about 145 years ago. That was the incandescent light bulb, and it's now unfortunately illegal to purchase. And that was just made illegal last year, unfortunately, in the United States anyway. And so the incandescent light bulb was sort of like if you go into those, fancy restaurants that were romantic and you see the Edison bulb and it's like warm and almost borderline candlelight vibes. It was much more akin to fire than as far as the wavelengths of light. And so it was much less disruptive. Still allowed to augment our days and still a little outside of the bounds of what we would have had previously, but at least it was warmer tones and a little less disruptive and excitatory. Whereas then
Mhm.
when we started in the 80s and 90s, shifting over to this LED centric approach from an energy efficient, energy conservation perspective, then not foreseeing the impact that this could make to our biology. And so now, what do we do in the face of that, considering that the average person is spending well over, it appears, 93% of their time indoors? And that's an old stat from 2001. It's likely much more pronounced now, post pandemic, work from home sort of revolution, smartphones, laptops, all the things. So then it's as simple as how can we get ourselves outside more routinely? Because if you measure the light in your indoor environment, it's most routinely sub around 1,000 lux. If you're lucky, most of them even less, so say like 200, 300 lux or what have you. Especially, I've measured all over the place in Starbucks and all these things. And you can measure this with download apps like Light Meter, Lux, or what have you. And you can just hold up your smartphone and see what's the light environment measurably in your space. Versus when you go outside, even on a cloudy day, it's going to have markedly more light exposure most often than you could possibly get outside or inside. So you want to be getting yourself physically outside as much as you can, as bright of days as possible. But then when the sun is setting, then you're looking to do exactly what you just said. So moving over your lighting to fire like light. So it would be oranges and reds so that it mimics what we would have been exposed to, that fiery nature. My husband makes fun of me about things like this. So he'll call me Darth Vader because I have all red lights everywhere. But somehow along the way, he's come to actually appreciate them. And now he even himself travels with like red motion lights and all the things. So eventually, once you're in that environment, you start to appreciate. And then when you do flip on the overhead, big, egregious, fluorescent LED light, it's like jarring.
Yeah.
But we tend to swim in these environments that just because of the familiarity effect from the fact that we have it, that this is just how life always was. So even though it's really a relatively new thing, so when that does happen, it's very, very alarming. And the other piece to remember is that our eyes become more sensitive throughout the course of the day. So that same exposure, so say whatever, your same light bulb that you might have at 8 a.m. is going to be more impactful at 8 p.m. Because of the fact that our eyes just almost have, it's almost their own circadian rhythm, and the sensitivity goes up throughout the course of the day.
Yeah. Oh, it makes so much sense. Okay. I agree. Red lighting our house. I mean, if people walk by our house at night, I joke it looks like a brothel.
Same.
But yeah,
Yeah.
we become so used to it.
Yeah.
So let's do a practical application here. Let's say we all come over for a slumber party at Mollie Eastman's house.
Yes.
And we're there at 5 p.m. Kind of do like a quick run through of getting dinner done. What's your screen life look like? What does your house look like? And then what does your morning look like?
Yes, I love that. Okay. So naturally, there will be a seasonality component here, and so many people hear this for the summer, and they're like, "Oh, I can do that. Great, yeah," because sun is up for so late, and then they can still have their later dinner and do all these things. But then the winter comes, and then people really get tripped up. So we do want to know that in historically there would have been a seasonality and shift to the type of sleep we would have been getting, and we imagine that in our winter months that it would have been kind of known as almost the season of melatonin, longer opportunity to sleep more, almost hibernate, kind of bear like, and get more sleep during that time. There would likely be less food access and more fasting, kind of slowing down, just a whole different shift. But because of our perfectly temperature controlled environment, 72 degrees or whatever, we're having that comfort, but it's creating a bit of a comfort crisis. And that's problematic. So If you come over when the sun would be setting, then right around that, we're aiming to make sure that we've eaten all the food we need to eat. That's kind of all done. Ideally, we've gotten all our exercise in. Now, that's not to say that you can't have certain like wind down, because exercise is a type of Zeitgeber that we do see you can still get movement later and have it still. So, I don't want to scare anyone because exercise is so crucial to getting great sleep and muscle mass and all of that. But it just kind of then it goes into the common sense piece where you're aiming to make sure you're not having like CrossFit training at 8 p.m. under blue lights, obviously. So, but you could potentially do some nice light stretching, yoga, candlelit, calming, down regulation, but still movement, or a light walk post, your last bite of food or whatever. Those things appear to all still be totally non-disruptive to sleep if you also track your own bio-individuality and make sure that you're seeing that it's all kind of serving you. So we would eat in alignment with when the sun is setting, and then once the sun is set, then brothel status, like you were speaking to, then it turns over to red light. And the aim is so that you really, in your environment, most of the time everything's pretty devoid of some of the cool toned lights, so you're not having to hopefully wear too much of the blue blockers. But if you want to have certain things, maybe watch a show or something, although I have had some people on the podcast that actually make custom covered red kind of filters for your TV that are wild. Now, I do not have that, mainly because my husband would freak out if I actually did that one. He would be like, okay, we do a lot of ridiculous things, but that is totally an option. I have clients that do that, especially single clients that don't have the other partner to fight back on that one. So I would do like blue blockers, and also proximity is a piece too. So if you're really close to very bright light, and by the way, all bright light, including red. If so, some people will do like big red light panels and all these things that are very, very bright. That can still be excitatory too. So it's not to say that it's just a blue phenomenon. It's all bright lights as well, but particularly that blue is going to be more excitatory. So shifting over the red, the brothel vibes. But then also what we're trying to do is create day mode and night mode. So another kind of circadian complement is something that I call thought timing, because we know that social interactions can act as a Zeitgeber. We know that technology and media use can act as a Zeitgeber. And so the thoughts that we have can create sort of excitatory or down regulatory effects. So our aim, especially as like entrepreneurs or people that can make their own schedule or have a sense that they could keep working if it was available to them, can have a hard time, and myself included, of giving ourselves the permission to be off and really just, closing that laptop, turning off the email access or whatever, and then shifting over to down regulation. And we are learning that thoughts appear to have this diurnal pattern. There's a great study called The Mind After Midnight that points to higher suicidality rates in the wee hours in the morning, change in thought patterns, kind of more catastrophic thinking, if you will, or anxious, depressive type thoughts in the wee hours of the morning. So we're finding that these our thoughts look very different at different times throughout the day. So in the evening, we're trying to cultivate, like, maybe it's connection with your kids, your partner, friends, just a time to be off and separate from the action of the day. And then we're also aiming to tackle stressors by day that we can hopefully just like leave be into the evening, which is easier said than done, I know. But how can we bring about thought timing and hopefully make it like a family affair? So my husband and I will always be going bantering back and forth, where out of all of these things that we're talking about, thought timing continues to be the thing that I have to continually work on, because my brain will keep going and I'll want to listen to another podcast, read another thing, watch a show, do the bit. And so thankfully my husband and I will be kind of partners in crime, and he'll be like, is talking about whatever your taxes or something a good time? Because this is good thought timing at 12 or 10 at night or whatever the heck. And so we want to ensure that we're kind of constantly keeping ourselves in check and not getting into bad kind of slippery habits with some of these things. So then I'd be shifting over, and you can totally still watch shows. This is not to mean that you can, like, I love The Office and just like relaxing, funny, light things that put us in a good mood. All those things can be great. But then ideally, just a little bit before bed, can we set aside some of our tech and just help. As a podcast guest I had on the other day, he termed it boring yourself to sleep a bit. So maybe you would like take out your Kindle or book or whatever, and maybe some light fiction or something. And then you're just sort of, lulled off because you're not taking on all of these big topics of your day and life. You're leaving those aside.
Yeah, I think that's so huge. I started a online book club for women because I was like, what can we anchor in the morning and at night for us busy women whose heads are always going? I love your term thought timing. So I was like, let's replace 10 minutes at night with reading a book. And I found this amazing amber book light. You would love it.
Yes.
So
Oh,
it's
totally.
circadian rhythm lighting.
Yep.
Yeah.
A
Because
hundred
I think,
percent.
I do definitely notice that shift. I think we all do. Like I don't know if you feel this. I think a lot of women can relate. Like little things can become big things at night. It's
Yes.
like we're starting to clear out the thoughts. And I think there's a school of thought where it's like, okay, let me think about it so I can get it off my plate. But if we can start to just table it for the next day, we're going to be so much more prepared and able to solve the problems during the day, the next day. Otherwise, that shit is going to creep up in the night. It does, right?
Totally.
When we can't make it better, and it's like nightmares. Like everything is worse at night.
100%. Yeah, we talk about that in our thought timing module where since we know some of these tendencies for our thoughts to be more kind of catastrophic or binary or black and white or whatever, probably every person listening has experienced this to some degree where, all the weight of the world is on your shoulders at 3 a.m. And then you wake up and you're like, oh, the sun is out. That's not that bad.
Right.
What am I talking about?
Oh, better. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, so how can we almost create like a personal contract with ourselves where we aim to not believe the types of thoughts that we're having at past midnight. And again, easier said than done, but the more you have that in the back of your mind and you kind of gave your word to not engaging with that as much, it almost provides this extra observer effect, and you can start to watch yourself and your thoughts a bit more. And that's where some of the traditional approaches for sleep can be really beneficial. So, for years, some of the thinking has been CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and so how to get some of those thoughts out of your head and maybe onto paper. So, like a brain dump, and just writing them all out, and draw a line down a piece of paper. We actually had a cohort participant that found on Amazon a red light pen. So then our whole cohort got red light pens. So it just like glows on the thing. So you can write if you do happen to wake up and you do have all these thoughts. Okay, fine. So can we get them out at least? And so you draw a line down the middle, you write every single worry thought possible and just get it out. And then on the right side of that paper, an action that you can plan to take around it to almost just close that loop for now so that the brain can be at ease. Or if you can't take an action around it, it's like, okay, I'm getting a divorce, or I'm dealing with health issues or whatever. Like, can we practice acceptance, surrender, which can be also really powerful.
Oh, love those things. Okay, let's talk real world. That's our ideal scenario. Maybe we live that 80% of the time, and then boom, you have a wedding. You have a
Yeah.
wedding to go to on a Saturday night, and you are being bombarded by music. Maybe you have some drinks. There is all the lighting. You get home at midnight. What does Mollie Eastman do on those nights?
I'm going to tell you a funny one. And so people might be like, what in the world? So, one of the things that I always pack for things like that is this. I have no affiliation with them, but Lucy gum. What is Lucy gum? It is the biohackers gum, the nicotine gum. Now, nicotine could take a whole other conversation. I think their motto is nicotine for normal people. And so
Wow.
why is that? Well, one, there's a lot of studies around nicotine for neuroplasticity, and looking at studies for it for things like Parkinson's and neurodegenerative disorders. And so different universities are looking into some of the efficacy for that. But I share that because half the time, so we know unequivocally alcohol, THC tend to really disrupt sleep. And I used to, be a big alcohol leaning person. And so now it's pretty rare because just seeing what it does for my sleep and what have you. So, but I still want to be able to have a state change often. So, and when we talk about state changing, it's kind of presumably why we would drink. Like we want to feel different than we do right now. So we drink a liquid or smoke a thing or whatever. So that state change, could we get other types of state changers? So That's one of the reasons why I really like nicotine gum because, and listen, and for anyone listening, here's what I'll tell you. After looking at hundreds and hundreds of wearable data points, now anything with a stimulant like effect, and these are micro dosing. When you talk about like a cigar, there's, can be 100 milligrams or so of nicotine, whereas we're talking for a gum like this, it's like 2 milligrams. Of course, you've probably seen transcriptions with the blue tongue, obviously. Now, the blue tongue approach has a little small amount of nicotine in there. And so they're aiming to leverage that kind of mood enhancing cognition effect. So it has this interesting entourage effect when you have nicotine with methylene blue, with some of the hemp components that they put in there, and all kinds of things, and caffeine. So, but that's for transcriptions. If you're doing just the nicotine, that it just gives you a little bit of like this energy boost, if you will. So I'll bring something like that. Sometimes I might bring like a little thing of kava or more controversially, kratom. So I'm well aware that kratom and nicotine are a little controversial. I think nicotine has a lot of promise of an interest of separating it from our preconceived notions of tobacco, bigger topics, but how can you get other state changers so that you can still let loose, feel different than normal? So I would play with some of those. Then there's even other crazy ones like intranasal oxytocin. We both know John Lawrence. And so different things that you might be able to bring in and feel differently. So playing with that. But then even on top of that, you're eating later, you're, dancing, you're interacting with those people, getting all these thoughts going. By the time you get home, it's very unlikely you're going to fall right asleep most of the time. You're still going to unwind and all that. So you're probably going to be going to bed much later, and maybe you had alcohol. Then what we're aiming to bring in is what we call the do nothing effect or the do nothing technique. And what do I mean by that? That ideally you're still conducting yourself the next day largely in the same way that you might have without that. Now, meaning that
Mhm.
you might swing out your wake up time a little bit, but hopefully not wildly so. So maybe you're still getting up, maybe it's like an hour and change later or something along those lines, but it's still tethered and anchored to your normal wake up time. And we all usually have friends that are like this, where even if they go out really late, they still wake up at around their same wake up time, and they sometimes are annoyed by this. Well, I would encourage them to be grateful, because hopefully, and I know it can be annoying, but it actually can point to a circadian aligned, a strong circadian pulse. And that's what we're looking to really promote, because our circadian rhythm can exist on a spectrum. And it can either be this weak circadian rhythm, which many of us are dealing with, or a strong pulsing circadian rhythm where you have a strong cortisol pulse by day and melatonin pulse in the evening. So if you
Mhm.
manage that you're still getting up at around the same time, a little bit later, but around the same time, and then you're not doing compensating techniques, which a lot of us will do. Then we'll have more caffeine, we'll take big long naps, or we'll say, I'm going to go to bed so early, I'm exhausted. Now, you could move it back a little bit, but we see people get into trouble where normally they go to bed at whatever, 11, and now they're trying to go to bed at like 8:39. And these things can all be very confusing and create problems where now you're laying in bed, and even though you're tired, it's like this tired but wired, and now you can't fall asleep, and now you create problems and new thoughts about your ability to sleep.
So just going back to the wedding scenario, the state changes, I'm all about the
Yes,
state changes. I think controversial has gone out the window. I
totally.
think we're all at a place where we want to do what works for us, and I think that's different for every person. So at least on this platform, that's what I'm here to talk about. So on that night, are there certain things that you would do for wind down? I'm curious your thoughts on melatonin.
Yeah, good question. So, what I would say is one kind of new thing that I've been adding in recently is the Somni. And the Somni is using transcranial electric stimulation. And actually, Matt Walker, who wrote Why We Sleep, is on the science advisory board. And the thinking is that it kind of measures your brain activity by day, or each evening, I should say, consistently. But then it starts to learn, what is Melissa's brain activity always looking like at around when she goes to bed? And then on the night where you come back from the wedding and it's all, much more alert and activated, because you're, kind of coming down from all of that. then it's applying sort of a different protocol in reaction to that to help you be able to downregulate and fall asleep faster, stay asleep, and increase sleep duration are all the points, aims there. And it was found in recent research out of Frontiers to be 4 times more effective than melatonin, 2 times more effective than CBTI, and 1.5 times more effective than Ambien. Now, still needs more research and what have you. But out of my own experience and with a number of clients, it's been definitely promising, more so than, there's a lot of gadgets that claim to be helpful for sleep, but this is one of the few that I've been finding. So I've been leaning towards that. Sometimes, so melatonin, I find that particularly helpful, especially for travel, when our circadian rhythm has gotten all out of whack. If I am coming back late and if I'm still aiming to do sort of the do nothing effect, I often know that I might have a shortened sleep duration than normal. So I might be wary of taking melatonin in that kind of scenario, or maybe not a ton, only just because I don't have the full opportunity to sleep that full night. So some people have different thoughts on melatonin for sure. But typically, when I think about utilizing it, it's for one, if I know I'm trying to retrain my circadian rhythm and I've gotten kind of off my normal schedule, I'm trying to pull it back, then that can be helpful to kind of prepare the body. And it's really this preparatory agent versus like an Ambien or something, because it helps to like lower that body temperature, prepare you for sleep. But you could experiment with it for sure. I mean, there's certainly crazier things than experimenting with that. But then I also might bring in some other things that might help me just wind down a bit more. So, and often it's, the magnesium, L-theanine, glycine sort of stack is a kind of go to nightly routine that seems to have pretty high safety profile. But then when you're dealing with some of those things like we're talking about, we're more amped up, then I might bring in more kind of GABA impacting agents, or some higher dose options to just really help wind me down, essentially.
Okay, and then the last question on that. So it sounds like for someone who maybe has to be up every morning during the week for work at like 6 a.m., and then the weekend comes, whether they went to a party or not, they're so excited to sleep in. They sleep till 9, 10 a.m. Not an ideal situation, right? We want to try
Yes,
to have like as much as we can, same wake up time every day.
exactly. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. That was so much information. I feel like we could talk for another hour, but I know we both have to wrap this up. We have places to go. There's a final question I would love to ask you to help people get a little bit more inside the head of Mollie Eastman. Totally random. Mollie, if there was a song that was like the theme song of your life right now, what would that song be?
So this is a funny one, and anyone that has kids might appreciate this. And I don't have kids, so this is sort of weird that this is my choice. But "Let It Go," straight out of Disney's Elsa, right? Very empowering song, by the way. In case it's no one's listened to this, totally listen. Very empowering. But I think it so perfectly fits to sleep and some of the things I constantly. I mean, as someone that went through a sleep kind of breakdown, typically what the trends, it can make sense that I tend to be an overthinker, tend to ruminate, spiral, all these things. So I have to really work on that thought timing piece and just let it go. And so much of sleep is training that muscle of letting things go. And I love some of the statements in that song of, it's funny how some distance makes everything seem small, and all of these things. Like, how can we get different perspective, or like the observer effect, like we're speaking to, right? So, how can we kind of work to train the muscle to let go of the things that aren't serving us?
I love that. And I imagine so many women that are listening to this, wherever they are, if they're still, experiencing their cycle, or if they're perimenopause, those middle of the night wake ups can be so familiar. And so,
Totally.
like you said, becoming the observer and just watching and witnessing. And so, not viscerally, like not taking it on in our body. I think
Yes.
about the things that I would tell my children if they wake me up in the middle of the night, like, it's okay. It's going to be so much better tomorrow when we talk about this. It's not going to be as scary. So
Yes.
just being able to almost like watch yourself as a little kid, like, this isn't going to be scary tomorrow. It's okay. And then let it
Love
go.
that.
I think we're all going to be singing that in our middle of the night wake up. So thank you for
Please.
sharing that. Before we wrap, any other closing remarks, any tools that you want to share? We will link everything below, all the resources all the products that we talked about for easy access. And then we'll make sure to share your social handle as well so anyone can message or reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. My closing thoughts would just be an opportunity to step into this concept that sleep is a skill. And so, anytime you might be struggling, or anytime you do wake up at 3 in the morning or what have you, it can be an opportunity to relate to this is not like, oh, I'm bad at this, or, I don't have the abilities. Instead, like any skill, it's just, all right, so maybe we're at whatever, sleep 101 or something. And we're now it has this opportunity to get curious and learn more about what things could influence this, and that we have an opportunity for mastery and continued mastery over this area.
Oh, love that. Thank you so much, Molly. All right. It was a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your
Ah,
wisdom, and we'll talk to you soon. Happy
you are
sleeping.
amazing. Thank you. Yeah, same to you. Thank you so much for the time. I so appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Molly. Make sure you check out all the resources below. We linked everything for you. If there's anything missing or you have any questions on this interview, go ahead and message me. As always, I love to hear your comments and feedback, so drop a comment below. If you liked and enjoyed this episode, go ahead and throw me a like, hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And then, as always, I know you were thinking of someone in your life when you were listening to this interview. Go ahead and click that share button and send it their way so they can enjoy this as well. See you soon. Thanks.